I obviously have a bit of an obsession with understanding five-man tower dives and whether they're efficient, whether they're good play, what the right way is to respond to them. I was asking on Twitter the other day about people's opinions on the right way to respond to a five-man tower dive in the bottom lane. And as I was watching, just catching up in the LMS Finals, and in Game 1 there was a five-man tower dive, and I just want to look at it using some of the tools in shadow.gg to kind of break down this one. I think there were a lot of mistakes either way, but just to look at some of the elements of it. So this is between Flash Wolves and G-Rex in Game 1. I'm going to full screen the video to watch it play out a little bit. So what happens first of all is Flash Wolves have control of the bottom side river mostly. They use the Ashe ult to kind of push Koala and Stitch back a little bit. They get control of the bottom lane. You can see Cassiopeia and Skarner are already moving into the river. There are red pings here, and G-Rex assume we're going to get our blue buff contested. So they move Xin Zhao and Karma over to defend their blue buff. They see, okay, Skarner and Cassiopeia are backing off, so they back off a little bit too. And here's where it gets really interesting, that Flash Wolves go from here, and they move into the tower dive. And what I'm not sure of is, the correct way to respond for G-Rex. I think there are two real options here. One is as soon as they get the sense that, okay, these guys aren't just backing off, they're actually going for a dive, they either need to move Karma and Xin Zhao bottom to defend and prepare Gnar to teleport down, assuming he has to match the Ornn teleport, because Ornn might not join, maybe it's just a four-man dive. Or they need to all in on a response, back their bottom lane off completely, sacrifice the tower, and shove elsewhere on the map. They kind of do neither, which is the real problem here. And that's not really the point. I'm not here to pick on G-Rex and point at their mistakes or whatever, but this ward I think here is countered, so when Skarner walks over, they may not be seeing him. Anyways, G-Rex secure their own blue buff, need to... And here they have a red ping, they have some red pings, so I assume that they suspect that this is coming, but they're just catching a wave in mid lane because they were spending time on the blue buff. Cassiopeia got to push, they got a priority out of mid lane. Right here now, Tahm Kench is backed off, but Varus is not, so he's teleporting back. Xin Zhao and Karma are hanging right around here, and right around now, if they didn't already know, like obviously now it's obvious the dive is actually happening. If they didn't already know it was happening, like I'm not really here to guess whether they should have really expected this was happening or not, but they don't have an instant way to get anybody there except for the Gnar. Ornn's teleport comes in, which I think was pretty unnecessary. I think he should have canceled it, or just not used it in the first place. So this turns into a five-man tower dive, but it kind of wasn't to start with. It was a four-man, which I personally think I still have a tendency towards four-man dives are more efficient than five-man. But I don't, my opinion on that kind of wavers a little bit, because this one works out really well. Partly because G-Rex were so indecisive on whether they were going to go down and defend. Gnar channeled and then canceled his teleport because it came in late, and by the time it was channeling, it was, it was all over. So I think in this case, given that that G-Rex had, that they lost mid lane priority, I think they probably couldn't really afford to respond down here 5v5. They could have teleported the Gnar in earlier if they had a little bit better information, but I think the better response would have been to more decisively sacrifice the bottom lane. Hey, we lost the map control, we lost the push, we lost priority at bottom and mid, give up the tower, and instead of, as you can see here, if we go back a little bit, instead of Karma kind of waffling, she's kind of hovering, she takes the wave, she moves toward bottom, she starts to recall, she's like, oh, I'm not really sure what's happening. Now she goes towards like, oh, I better go help. Oh, maybe not, I'll go back. Like, there's a lot of wasted time here that I think they could have gotten a better push. And why this really matters is because if they had just decisively made the conservative play, backed off, and shoved mid and top, there would have been, a few extra seconds here. Gnar would have saved his teleport and still had that tool for later. They could have stolen this blue buff a little more quickly. And if they'd done all of that, then this next little phase here wouldn't have happened, where Karma's recalling in the river. Has to burn Flash to avoid an Ashe ult here, I believe. And it all turns into, Gnar's respawning bottom. They have nobody mid because the Karma was so slow getting back in there. Xin Zhao wasn't defending it. the duo lane went top. Like there were a lot of inefficient decisions, I think, from GRX here. But if they had been quicker and more decisive, some of these inefficiencies wouldn't have had to come up. So I'm not sure where this really lands on whether it's better to respond 5-man or not. I think in this case it leans towards responding wouldn't have been the right move. But I also think that when we see teams like LPL teams that do respond with a 5-man defense in the bottom lane, it's because they I think sense it coming early or have a little bit more information, and because they decisively act on that defense. And that's why I think when they do defend, that's one of the reasons they do defend more often, just because they're more prepared for it, and also why it works out a little better for them. Not all the time, but sometimes. And the overall consequence of this, I set up some delta markers. So between the 13 and 15 minute marks of this game, that series of the dive and the rotations afterwards, Flashwell's got a 1,600 gold swing in their advantage, based on 2 kills, a tower. GRX, pushing the other lanes did give them, a 7 CS lead in that 2-minute time span, but it obviously wasn't nearly enough to counter. And you can't count the tower damage that they got in top lane here, but it wasn't very much. So it doesn't really, count for a whole lot here. And I think if GRX had responded more decisively and a little more appropriately, this gold swing wouldn't have been quite so big. They didn't have to give up those kills in the bottom lane. That would have accounted for a good chunk of the gold too. And they could have gotten, that CS gap could have been a little bit bigger. And then some of the uncounted resources like the flashes and the teleports and so on. So I don't know, that wasn't really a clear takeaway from this. I just thought it was an interesting kind of series of play to take a look at. And happy to discuss further.